At first, nobody thought the photograph was important. It was just another piece of evidence inside an old police archive. A small black and white photograph, slightly damaged. The edges were yellow with age. There was nothing dramatic about it. No blood, no obvious crime, no strange symbol. Just an empty street outside an old building on a cold evening. But there was one problem. Someone was standing in the photograph. And according to every official record connected to the case, nobody was supposed to be there. The photograph had been taken decades earlier, during an investigation into a disappearance in a small European town. The missing person had never been found. The case had eventually gone cold. The officers involved had retired. Some had died. The building in the photograph had changed owners several times. Almost everything connected to the investigation had disappeared into history, except the evidence box. Years later, during an archive review, someone opened it again. Inside were old reports, witness statements, maps, handwritten notes, and several photographs. Most of them were ordinary. Then they reached the last photograph. It showed the entrance to the building, a window on the second floor, a narrow street, a parked vehicle, and in the darkness behind the window, a human figure. At first, the archivist assumed it was a reflection. Then a second person examined the image. They noticed the shape was too clear. It looked like a man standing completely still. His face appeared to be turned toward the camera. There was no record of anyone being inside that room when the photograph was taken. In fact, the official report said the building had been empty. That was not the only problem. The photograph had been catalogued with a precise time, 8:17 in the evening. The same time appeared in the original evidence report. Investigators had documented the building as empty at 8:17. They had entered the property shortly afterward. They had searched the room. Nobody was there. No second person had been reported. No witness had mentioned seeing anyone at the window. So how had a person appeared in the photograph? There are many ways an old photograph can deceive the eye. Reflections can look like people. Shadows can form faces. Damaged film can create shapes. A photograph can even be altered without anyone noticing. That should have been the end of it. But when the image was examined more carefully, another detail appeared. The figure was not looking into the room. He was looking directly toward the camera, and beside him was something else. A small object on the windowsill. An object that did not appear anywhere in the original evidence report. That object would eventually become one of the most important clues in the entire case. Because the deeper the photograph was examined, the less it looked like a mistake. It looked like evidence. Evidence of someone who officially was never there. And the question was no longer whether the photograph was strange. The question was much worse. Who was the man in the window? And why had the police never recorded him? Before the photograph became mysterious, the case itself was painfully ordinary. A person disappeared. There was no dramatic struggle, no confirmed sighting after the final evening, no clear suspect, no message explaining where the person had gone. The disappearance happened in a quiet European town where most people knew each other. The missing person was a 34-year-old man named Daniel Voss. Daniel worked as a technical draftsman for a small engineering company. He lived alone in a rented apartment above a bakery. His routine was predictable. He left for work in the morning. He returned in the evening. He usually stopped at the same cafe. Then he went home. There was nothing unusual about him disappearing until one Monday morning. Daniel did not arrive at work. His employer called his apartment. Nobody answered. A colleague went to check on him. Daniel's apartment was locked. His wallet was inside. His keys were inside. His coat was hanging beside the door. His passport was in a drawer. Even his car was still parked outside. It did not look like someone preparing to leave. It looked like someone who had simply stopped existing. Police entered the apartment later that afternoon. There was no obvious sign of violence. The kitchen was clean. A cup was sitting beside the sink. A half-finished book was lying on the table. Daniel's work documents were arranged neatly beside his desk. Nothing suggested he had planned to disappear. Investigators began reconstructing his final day. According to his colleagues, Daniel had left work at approximately 5:40 in the afternoon. A cafe owner remembered seeing him shortly afterward. At around 6:15, Daniel supposedly walked toward the old building on the edge of town. That building would become the center of the investigation. It had once been a small boarding house. By the time Daniel disappeared, it had been mostly abandoned. Only one elderly caretaker occasionally visited the property. Police initially believed Daniel might have gone there for a private reason. Perhaps he knew someone inside. Perhaps he had discovered something. Or perhaps he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. At 7:30 that evening, a local resident reported seeing Daniel near the building. That was the last confirmed sighting. At 8 o'clock, police were contacted. At 8:17, officers arrived at the building. They searched the ground floor first, then the upper rooms. They found nothing. No Daniel, no obvious struggle, no second person, no broken window, no hidden room, nothing. The building appeared completely empty. Investigators photographed the exterior and several rooms before leaving. One of those photographs was the image that would later become infamous. But at the time, nobody noticed anything unusual. The case continued for weeks, then months. Search teams checked roads, rivers, abandoned structures, and surrounding fields. Daniel's photograph was distributed to nearby police departments. Nothing happened. No body was found. No reliable suspect emerged. Eventually, the case became another unsolved disappearance. The official conclusion was simple. Daniel had vanished voluntarily, or had died somewhere investigators had failed to locate. The old building was not considered significant enough to investigate again. The evidence was boxed. The reports were archived, and the photograph disappeared into storage. For years, that was the entire story. Then the archive was reorganized. The old evidence box was opened, and someone finally looked closely at the photograph. At first, they saw only the building, then the window, then the figure, a man standing behind the glass, completely still, watching the camera. The strangest part was not that someone appeared in the window. It was that the police had already searched that room, and they had documented it as empty. But there was still one innocent explanation. The figure could have been a reflection. If that explanation was correct, the mystery would end immediately. So investigators enlarged the photograph. And that was when they noticed something that made the reflection theory much harder to accept. The figure appeared to have one hand resting on the windowsill. And beside that hand was a small object. An object that should not have been there, because the original room inventory contained no such object, and the photograph had been taken before anyone could have placed it there. The case had just changed. It was no longer simply about a missing man. It was about evidence that appeared to contradict the official timeline, and someone, somewhere, had been standing inside that room. The police simply never admitted seeing him. The photograph was enlarged again. This time, investigators were not looking at the entire building. They were looking only at the window. The figure became clearer. Not clear enough to identify, but clear enough to remove one possibility. It did not look like a simple shadow. The outline of the head was visible. The shoulders were visible. One arm appeared to rest against the windowsill, and the face seemed to be turned toward the camera. That created an immediate problem. The photograph had been taken from the street. The photographer was standing outside the building. The window was on the second floor. If the figure had been standing inside the room, he should have been visible to the officers who searched it. But the original report said the room was empty. There was another problem. The window itself was closed. The curtains were partly open. The figure stood behind them. That meant the person had not simply appeared as a reflection from outside. At least, that was what the photograph seemed to suggest. Investigators went back to the original case file. The room was described in surprisingly precise detail. A wooden desk, one chair, a small cabinet, 2 windows, dust across the floor, nothing else. No person, no clothing, no personal belongings. No evidence that anyone had recently occupied the room. The report even contained a handwritten note from one of the original officers. The room had been searched twice. That sentence changed everything. If the figure had really been inside the room, then one of 2 things had happened. The officers had missed someone standing beside the window, or the photograph did not show what everyone thought it showed. The second possibility seemed more reasonable. Old photographs can be deceptive. Light can create strange shapes. Glass can reflect objects from behind the photographer. Film can be damaged. The photograph had spent decades inside an archive. Perhaps the mysterious figure was nothing more than a combination of shadows and reflections. So investigators tested the image. They examined the surrounding windows. They compared the angle of the streetlights. They studied the position of the camera. They looked for anything outside the building that could have created the shape. Nothing provided a perfect explanation. Then they noticed something much smaller. The figure's hand. It seemed to be resting on the windowsill. That was strange, because reflections usually follow the same perspective as the objects creating them. The hand did not. It appeared to belong to the figure itself. And beside the hand was a small rectangular object. At first, nobody knew what it was. It could have been a book, a box, a piece of equipment, or simply damage on the film. But when the image was compared with another photograph taken from almost the same position, the object appeared again. That second photograph had been taken only minutes later. The figure was gone. The object remained. This was the first real contradiction. If the object was part of the window or room, it should have appeared in both images. If it was damage on the film, it should not have appeared in a separate photograph. And if it was a real object placed on the windowsill, someone had placed it there. But nobody was supposed to have entered the room. Investigators returned to the original photographs. The timestamps were consistent. The first photograph had been taken at approximately 8:17. The second was taken shortly afterward. The building had not been entered between them. The officers were still outside. No person was seen entering through the front door. No person was seen leaving. The mysterious figure appeared in one photograph, then disappeared. The object remained. That detail transformed the investigation. Now there was physical evidence suggesting something had been inside the room, something the original police report never mentioned. Then another discovery appeared. In the original case file was a small hand-drawn map. It showed the building's second floor. The mysterious window was marked with a circle. Next to it was a handwritten question. 3 words. Who was there? Nobody knew who had written it. The handwriting did not match the main investigator's notes. It did not match the evidence technician's handwriting either, and there was no explanation for why the question had been written. For years, nobody had noticed it. Now, it suddenly seemed important, because someone working on the case had apparently noticed the same strange detail, and they had asked the exact question investigators were asking decades later. Who was there? The answer should have been simple. But when the team reconstructed the events of that evening, minute by minute, they discovered something far more disturbing. The mysterious figure did not simply appear at the wrong time. He appeared at a time when, according to the official timeline, the room should have been completely empty. And that meant the next step was obvious. They had to reconstruct the entire evening, not approximately, not from memory, minute by minute, because somewhere between Daniel's last confirmed sighting and the moment the photograph was taken, the official story had a gap, and somebody, or something, was inside that gap. The investigators stopped looking at the photograph. For the first time, they looked at the clock. If the photograph was genuine, then the answer had to exist somewhere inside the final hours of Daniel Voss. So they rebuilt that evening, minute by minute. 5:40 p.m. Daniel leaves work. 5:58 p.m. A colleague sees him walking toward the center of town. 6:12 p.m. Daniel enters a small cafe. The owner remembers him clearly. 6:24 p.m. Daniel leaves. 6:41 p.m. A resident reports seeing him near the old building. Then the trail becomes uncertain. There are no confirmed sightings between 6:41 and 7:30. At 7:30, another witness claims to have seen Daniel near the building. That was important, because the building was only a few minutes from Daniel's apartment. If he had gone inside, he could have returned home easily, but he never did. At 8 p.m., police received the first report that Daniel is missing. At approximately 8:17 p.m., officers arrive at the building. That was when the photograph was taken. The timeline looked simple, until investigators checked the original police records. The arrival time was not 8:17. The first officer's written report said 8:26, 9 minutes later. That should have been a minor clerical error, but the photograph was labeled 8:17. If the label was correct, the photograph was taken before the officers officially arrived. If the report was correct, somebody else had taken the photograph. And that created the first major contradiction. Who took it? The evidence file identified the photographer as a police technician, but the technician's own log placed him at another location until after 8:20. That meant he could not have taken the photograph at 8:17, unless the time on the photograph was wrong. So investigators tested that possibility. The camera used by police that evening was an older mechanical model. Its clock could drift. That gave them an explanation. The photograph might not have been taken at 8:17. Perhaps it was taken several minutes later. That seemed to solve the problem. until they examined the second photograph. Both photographs were taken using the same camera. Their sequence numbers showed they had been taken only moments apart. The camera's internal timing could not explain the discrepancy. Something was wrong. The team went back to the police technician's log. His handwriting was clear. He had written that he arrived at the building at 8:24. The first photograph was supposedly taken at 8:17. That was impossible, unless the photograph had been taken by someone else. The investigators began searching the case file for another photographer. They found one name. A local newspaper photographer had arrived at the scene that night. His name was Elias Mercer. He had been following the disappearance for the newspaper. His presence had been mentioned only once. His photographs were never included in the main evidence inventory. That was unusual. So they searched the newspaper archives. The original newspaper photographs were still preserved. And one image immediately caught their attention. It showed the old building from across the street. The angle was almost identical to the police photograph. But there was something else. A small number had been written on the back, the same number that appeared on the police photograph. Investigators compared the negatives. They appeared to come from the same sequence. Now there were two possibilities. Either the police photograph had been incorrectly attributed to the police technician, or the newspaper photographer had somehow taken the image and it had later entered the police archive. Neither explanation answered the biggest question. Why had nobody mentioned the photograph? The investigators contacted the newspaper's archive. They discovered that Elias Mercer had taken several photographs that night, but only 3 had been published. The remaining photographs had been stored and eventually forgotten. One of those unpublished images was missing, the evidence photograph. Then came another discovery. Elias Mercer had written notes on the back of his remaining photographs. One note said, "Window occupied." That sentence was underlined. No explanation, no name, no further detail. Just 2 words. Window occupied. The investigators now had something they had never had before. Independent evidence that someone had been visible in that window. It was not simply a police photograph. A journalist had apparently noticed the same thing, but Elias Mercer had never mentioned the person in his newspaper article. Why? The obvious explanation was that he had mistaken a shadow for a person. Perhaps he later realized his mistake. Perhaps the note meant nothing. But then investigators discovered that Mercer had taken another photograph from a different angle. The window was visible again. The figure was not, but the small object on the windowsill was. That meant the object was real. Not film damage, not a reflection. Something had actually been sitting there. And now the investigation had a new question. What was the object? Because if they could identify it, they might finally understand what had happened inside the room. The original police inventory listed everything found inside the building. Almost everything. But one item was missing from the list. A small rectangular box, and according to a handwritten note found inside the archive, that box had been removed from the room before the official search was completed. Nobody had recorded who removed it, nobody had recorded where it went, and nobody could explain why. The timeline was no longer simply broken. It had been edited. Someone had entered the story between the lines, and the next discovery would suggest that this was not the first time it had happened. The missing box became the center of the investigation. According to the surviving notes, it had been found near the second-floor window. The same window where the mysterious figure appeared. The same window where the small object was visible in the photographs. Yet the official inventory did not contain it. There was no evidence number, no description, no photograph, no signature showing who had taken it. It was as if the box had briefly existed inside the case, and then been erased from it. Investigators searched the archive again. Nothing. They checked storage records. Nothing. They checked the property records for the old building. Nothing. Then they found a reference to it, in an unrelated document. A handwritten statement from one of the original officers. The statement was never included in the main report. It had been filed separately. The officer wrote that a small metal container had been discovered upstairs. He did not describe its contents, but he wrote one unusual sentence. It was not part of the premises. That meant somebody had brought it there. The investigators immediately returned to the photographs. The object beside the figure was rectangular. The size appeared consistent with the metal container, but there was still no explanation for why it had been removed. So they looked at the officer who had written the statement. His name was Henrik Vale. Vale had been one of the first officers inside the building. His official report stated that he entered the second floor at approximately 8:30. He searched the eastern room. He found nothing, but his private note suggested something different. He had found the container. That contradiction raised another question. Why would an experienced police officer leave such an important discovery out of his official report? There was no answer. Vale had died years earlier. His personal records were eventually located in a municipal archive. Most were ordinary. Old photographs, letters, retirement documents. Then investigators found a small notebook. It contained dates and short sentences. Most entries meant nothing, but one entry matched the night Daniel disappeared. Do not reopen the upstairs room. Nothing else. No explanation. No name. No reason. The investigators initially thought the note might have been unrelated. Then they found another entry several weeks later. The photograph is wrong. That sentence had been underlined twice. Now the mystery became much darker. Vale had apparently seen the photograph. He had noticed something wrong with it. But he never explained what. The investigation team searched for any surviving relatives who might have known about his concerns. They found his daughter. She remembered that her father had spoken about the Daniel Voss case only once. According to her, he had described it as the case with the impossible room. That phrase had never appeared in the official records. She also remembered something else. Her father had kept a photograph from the investigation in a private drawer. After his death, the photograph disappeared. Nobody knew where it went. The investigators searched the family home. They found nothing. For a moment, the trail seemed to end. Then a retired neighbor contacted them. He said he remembered Vale visiting him shortly after Daniel disappeared. Vale had asked him a strange question, whether anyone had seen a man entering the old building before the police arrived. The neighbor said no. Vale apparently asked the same question again. Then he asked something even stranger. Did anyone see him leave? The neighbor assumed Vale was talking about Daniel, but decades later, he wasn't sure. Because Vale had not said Daniel's name, he had said him, one word. One person. Someone apparently seen inside the building. Someone who had never been officially identified. Investigators now had several independent pieces of evidence. The photograph, the second photograph, the missing container, the private notes, and the testimony about Vale's unusual questions. None of them proved anything on their own. Together, they suggested that the original investigation had not been as straightforward as the official record claimed. Then the team discovered something that changed the entire case. The old building had once contained a second entrance, not a front entrance. A narrow service entrance at the rear. It had been sealed years before Daniel disappeared. But historical plans showed something important. The service entrance connected directly to the second floor, and according to the building records, it could be opened from inside without a key. If someone had entered through that route, they could have reached the mysterious room without being seen from the street. But there was still a problem. The entrance was supposedly sealed on the night Daniel disappeared. Investigators found photographs proving it. The door was closed. The lock appeared intact. There were no obvious footprints, no damaged hinges, nothing suggesting anyone had used it. Then they noticed the date on the photograph. The service entrance had been sealed the following morning, not that evening. That meant the entrance had still been usable when Daniel disappeared. Someone could have entered the building without using the main entrance. Someone could have reached the second floor. Someone could have stood behind the window, and someone could have left without being seen. The original investigators had apparently known about the entrance, but it was never mentioned in the final report. Now the question became unavoidable. Why? Why had an entire entrance been removed from the official story? And what exactly had been inside that metal container? Because if the container belonged to whoever had been inside that room, it might contain the one thing the investigators had been missing for decades. A connection to the person in the photograph, and perhaps a connection to Daniel Voss. The rear entrance changed the investigation. For decades, everyone had assumed the old building had only one practical way in, the front door. That assumption was wrong. The rear service entrance had existed for years. It connected directly to the upper floor, and on the night Daniel disappeared, it was still usable. But there was something even more important. The investigators discovered that the service entrance had been photographed. The photograph was buried inside a separate municipal archive. It showed the rear of the building at approximately 8:20 that evening. The door appeared closed, but the lock was different from the one shown in later photographs. Someone had opened it, then locked it again. That meant someone could have entered without leaving an obvious sign of forced entry. The team reconstructed the route. A person could approach the rear of the building, enter through the service door, climb a narrow staircase, reach the second floor, enter the room beside the mysterious window, then leave through the same route. From the street, nobody would see them. But that still did not explain Daniel. There was no evidence that he had entered through the rear. Then investigators found something unexpected. A witness statement from a woman named Clara Weiss. It had been recorded 2 days after Daniel disappeared. Clara lived across from the rear alley. She told police she had heard footsteps that evening. 2 people, not one. She remembered hearing one person enter the building. Then, several minutes later, another person. The original report dismissed the statement. The officer wrote that the sounds could have come from the building settling. But Clara had insisted. She knew the difference between footsteps and ordinary noises. She had lived there for 20 years. The strange thing was that her statement disappeared from the main case file. It survived only because Clara had kept a carbon copy. Now investigators had another contradiction. The official investigation had recorded no evidence of anyone else inside the building, but a witness claimed there were 2 people, and the photograph showed one unidentified figure. The team began asking a simple question. Could the figure have been Daniel? The answer initially seemed possible. The photograph was too unclear to identify him. The height appeared similar. The body shape could have matched. But there was one problem. Daniel was reportedly wearing a dark coat that evening. The figure in the window appeared to be wearing a light-colored shirt. That made identification uncertain. Then came a more serious discovery. Daniel's colleague had described his clothing differently. He remembered Daniel wearing a light shirt under his coat. If the figure had removed his coat, the photograph could theoretically show Daniel. But why would Daniel be standing inside the abandoned building? And why had nobody found him? The investigators examined the room again using the original architectural plans. There was a small storage area behind the wall. It had been sealed decades later, but the plans showed that the room once contained a narrow cavity used for electrical equipment. It was not large enough for a person, but it was large enough to hide a small box. That possibility led investigators back to the missing metal container. Could it have been hidden there? They searched the modern building. The cavity was gone, but part of the original wall remained. A small section had never been renovated. When the bricks were carefully examined, investigators found a rectangular outline. Someone had once removed a section of the wall. Inside was nothing, but the dust pattern showed that something had been stored there for a long time. Then, they found a tiny piece of metal. A fragment from an old container. It had a number engraved into it. Not a police evidence number, a serial number. The investigators searched historical records for the manufacturer. The company had produced small metal document boxes used by banks, offices, and government departments. Nothing unusual. Until they discovered where one particular batch had been delivered. A regional police department. The same department that investigated Daniel's disappearance. That did not prove the container had belonged to police. But it created another possibility. The box may have been police property. If so, someone from inside the investigation could have placed it in the building. The mystery was becoming less supernatural and more disturbing. Someone might have manipulated the evidence. Someone might have known the building. Someone might have known exactly where investigators would search. And someone might have deliberately removed the container before the final report was completed. Then investigators discovered what had been inside the box. Not from the original evidence, from an old inventory document found in a completely different archive. The document listed 3 items: a key, a handwritten address, and a photograph. All 3 were marked as belonging to the Daniel Voss investigation, but none of them appeared in the official evidence inventory. The photograph was especially important. It was dated 3 days before Daniel disappeared, and on the back was a handwritten sentence: "Meet me where nobody looks." The handwriting had never been identified. Investigators compared it with Daniel's known handwriting. The similarities were strong, but not conclusive. Then they compared it with Henrik Vale's handwriting. The similarities were even stronger. That created a disturbing possibility. Maybe Daniel had left the message. Maybe Vale had written it. Or maybe someone had deliberately copied one of their writing styles. There was still one unanswered question. Why would a police officer hide evidence from his own investigation? And why would the photograph in the window appear to show someone who was never mentioned? The case had now reached a point where coincidence was becoming difficult to defend, but the darkest discovery was still ahead, because the address written on the back of the photograph did not belong to Daniel, it belonged to Henrik Vale, and it was not his home. It was another location, a place connected to an older disappearance, a disappearance that had happened years before Daniel ever vanished. The second disappearance changed everything. Investigators searched the older case. The missing person was a woman named Elise Marin. She had disappeared 11 years before Daniel Voss. Different year, different circumstances, same town, and the same old building appeared in the file. Elise had been seen near it shortly before she vanished. That was the first connection. The second was stranger. One photograph from Elise's case showed the same second-floor window. The image was taken from almost exactly the same angle, and once again, the window appeared empty, at least at first glance. When the photograph was enlarged, there was a faint human shape behind the glass. It was almost invisible, but the position was remarkably similar to the figure in Daniel's photograph. Now investigators had a problem. 2 disappearances, 11 years apart, 2 photographs, the same building, the same window, and in both images, something appeared behind the glass. This was the point where theories began multiplying. The first theory was simple. The photographs had been manipulated. Perhaps someone had deliberately inserted the figure. If that were true, the entire mystery could be explained. A person could have altered the photographs to create the appearance of someone standing inside the building. The problem was the second photograph, and the older photograph from Elise's case. 3 separate images would have needed to be altered. The images were stored in different archives. They had different negatives, and there was no evidence showing who could have altered them. Still, manipulation remained possible. The second theory was more disturbing. Someone had been using the old building for years. The building had been largely abandoned. It offered privacy, it had hidden entrances, it had rooms that were rarely checked. Perhaps someone had been meeting people there. Perhaps Elise and Daniel had both discovered something they were never supposed to see. That theory explained the building. It explained the hidden entrance. It explained the mysterious figure. But it did not explain the photographs. If someone had been using the building, why would they deliberately allow themselves to appear in photographs? The third theory came from the strangest piece of evidence, the handwritten address. Some investigators believed Henrik Vale had discovered a connection between the 2 disappearances. Perhaps he suspected that the same person was involved. Perhaps he had hidden evidence because he believed someone inside the police department could not be trusted. This would explain why his private notebook contained warnings. It would explain the missing container. It would explain why certain documents never appeared in the official report. But it created another problem. Why had Vale never publicly reopened the case? He had remained silent for years. He retired. He never published his findings. He never accused anyone. If he knew something important, he took it with him. There was also a fourth theory, and this one was the most controversial. The figure in the photographs might not have been the same person. Perhaps the similarity was simply caused by perspective, a shadow in one photograph, a reflection in another, a real person in the third. Human beings are very good at seeing patterns, especially faces and human shapes. The investigators knew that. They did not want to create a mystery where none existed, so they tried to destroy their own theory. They compared the photographs digitally. The figure's position was different. Its proportions were different. Even the apparent shape of the head changed slightly. That weakened the idea that the exact same person appeared in both photographs. But it did not solve the mystery, because the object on the windowsill remained. In the Daniel photograph, the object was clearly visible. In the later photograph, it was still there. And in Elise's older photograph, something similar appeared on the same windowsill. 3 photographs, 3 different years, 1 location, 1 recurring object. Now investigators considered the possibility that the object itself was the real clue. They enhanced the image. Its shape became clearer. It looked like a small metal case. The same type of case described in the missing evidence report. The same type of case whose fragment had been found inside the wall. That was difficult to ignore. The object had apparently existed in the building long before Daniel disappeared. If that was true, then Daniel may not have been the beginning of the story. He may have been the latest person to encounter it. Investigators returned to Elise's case. Her original evidence file contained one unusual detail. She had reportedly told a friend that someone was watching her. The friend remembered a phrase, "He knows where I go." At the time, police believed Elise was referring to an ordinary stalker. No suspect was ever identified, but now the phrase seemed different. Investigators asked whether Elise had ever mentioned the old building. The answer was yes. She had. Several days before disappearing, Elise had reportedly asked about it. She wanted to know who owned the upper floor. The property records showed something unexpected. The upper floor had once been rented to a private company. The company had no obvious connection to Elise or Daniel. But its records were incomplete. And one name appeared repeatedly: Henrik Vale. Not as an employee, not as an owner, as a contact. That discovery made the investigators reconsider everything. Maybe Vale had not hidden evidence because he was involved. Maybe he had hidden it because he was afraid. Perhaps he had discovered something inside the police investigation that he believed could put people in danger. Or perhaps he was the person who had created the mystery in the first place. There was still no proof, only contradictions. But one thing was becoming clear: the photographs were not the beginning of the mystery. They were the surviving traces of something much older, something that had already been happening before Daniel disappeared, and now investigators had to answer the most dangerous question yet. What exactly had Henrik Vale discovered inside that building? Because the answer might explain why the evidence disappeared, and why two people who came near the same window were never seen again. By this point, the case had accumulated too many contradictions to ignore. But contradictions are not proof. A strange photograph does not automatically mean a hidden conspiracy. A missing document does not automatically mean someone erased evidence. And two disappearances connected to one building do not automatically mean the same person was responsible. The investigators needed the most ordinary explanation that could account for the greatest number of facts. They started with the photograph. The figure behind the window was not perfectly clear. When the image was reconstructed from the original negative, its shape changed slightly. The face became less obvious. The body appeared narrower. The supposed hand became difficult to distinguish. That suggested the original image might have been distorted by reflections. The old window contained several layers of glass. Streetlights could reflect from different angles. A person standing outside could appear to be inside. An object behind the photographer could also appear in the window. That explained the figure, but it did not explain the metal box. For that, investigators looked at the building itself. The box could have belonged to the former tenant. The building had changed ownership several times. Records showed that old equipment and documents had been left behind over the years. The container may simply have been forgotten. Someone could have moved it. Someone could have placed it near the window. That explained why it appeared in photographs. It also explained why a fragment of the box remained inside the wall. There was nothing supernatural about it. Nothing impossible. Just an old building containing forgotten objects. Then came the problem of the hidden entrance. That too had an ordinary explanation. The rear entrance had been sealed later because the building was considered unsafe. The police had known about it. But the original report focused on the front entrance because investigators believed Daniel had approached the building from that direction. The missing reference might have been poor documentation rather than deliberate deception. Again, a reasonable explanation. Then came Henrik Vale. Why did his notebook contain strange comments? Why did he write that the photograph was wrong? Why did he ask whether someone had entered the building? The investigators found an answer. Vale had been responsible for reviewing several witness statements. He was known to write private notes when information seemed unreliable. He did not necessarily believe there was a conspiracy. He may simply have been frustrated with contradictions in the case. His warning about the upstairs room could have meant that he believed investigators had overlooked something. His statement about the photograph being wrong may have referred to the timestamp, not the figure. That was important. The mystery was beginning to collapse. The photographs could be explained. The metal box could be explained. The hidden entrance could be explained. Vale's notes could be explained. Even the connection with Elise might have an ordinary explanation. The old building was simply a place people passed through. Two disappearances happening near the same location could be coincidence. But then investigators examined the evidence one final time. They compared the two photographs. The figure in Daniel's photograph was probably a reflection. The figure in Elise's photograph was probably a shadow. They were not identical. That seemed to settle it. Then they looked at the windowsill. The object was still there, in both cases. 11 years apart, the same small rectangular shape, the same position, and the same strange angle. If it was simply a forgotten box, why had it remained there for more than a decade? The building had been entered many times. The room had been searched. The window had been photographed, yet the object remained. That did not prove anything. But it created one final problem. Investigators returned to the original room inventory. The list described the desk, the chair, the cabinet, the curtains, the windows. It described almost everything. But there was no box, no container, no object on the windowsill. That meant either the inventory was incomplete, or someone had removed the box before the official inventory was made. The missing box suddenly mattered again. And then the investigators found something they had not expected. The serial number from the metal fragment matched a box manufactured for a government department. Not a bank, not a private company, a government department. The box had been produced in limited quantities. Only a few hundred existed. Most had been destroyed decades earlier. A surviving distribution record showed that one had been issued to the local police department. The date was important. The box had been issued before Elise disappeared, and it was still officially assigned to the department when Daniel disappeared. That did not prove the police had placed it inside the building, but it made the possibility much harder to dismiss. Someone connected to the investigation had access to that box, and someone had removed it. Now the simplest explanation had a serious weakness. Maybe the photographs were innocent. Maybe the figure was a reflection. Maybe the disappearances were unrelated. But the evidence had still been handled strangely, and the missing box was still unexplained. Then investigators discovered one final fact about Henrik Vale. The day after Daniel disappeared, Vale requested access to the evidence archive. The request was approved. He entered alone. He remained inside for 17 minutes. No record explains what he examined. But after that visit, one evidence item was missing: the metal container. That was the first piece of evidence directly connecting a person to the disappearance of the box. It did not prove Vale knew what had happened to Daniel. It did not prove he was responsible, but it changed the question. The mystery was no longer, who was the person in the window? It became, what did Henrik Vale find inside that box? And why did he make sure nobody else could find it? For years, investigators had searched for the person in the photograph. Now they were searching for something else: the box. If Henrik Vale had removed it from the evidence archive, then there had to be a reason. The problem was that Vale had been dead for years. His personal belongings had already been examined by his family. Nothing obvious remained. No box. No photograph. No hidden documents. Then an archivist found a reference to an old storage locker. It had belonged to Vale. The locker had been closed after his death, but several boxes had never been opened. Inside were ordinary personal items: old clothes, books, receipts, a broken camera. Then, underneath a stack of newspapers, they found a sealed envelope. There was no name on it, only one date: the date Daniel disappeared. Inside was a single photograph. The investigators immediately recognized the building. It was the same building from the police photograph. But this photograph had been taken from inside. The photographer was standing in the upstairs room. The window was visible from behind. The photograph showed the street outside, and standing across the road was Daniel Voss, alive. That was already important. But the photograph contained something else. In the reflection of the glass, another person could be seen standing behind the photographer. The face was not visible, only the outline of the body, a person standing inside the room. The investigators compared the position with the original photograph. The mysterious figure was now on the wrong side of the window. That changed the entire interpretation. The figure might never have been outside looking in. It might have been inside the room, standing behind the photographer. The photograph itself could have been taken from inside the building, but that created another contradiction. The original police photograph had been taken from the street, so how could the same figure appear from two different angles? Investigators examined the negative. The reflection was real, but the face was impossible to identify. Then they noticed something else. The photograph had a small mark in the corner, a number. The same number that appeared on the missing evidence container. That was the connection they had been searching for. The box and the photograph were part of the same evidence sequence. But why had Vale kept the photograph? The answer came from the back. There was writing. Only one sentence. Daniel was not alone. That was all. No explanation, no name, no accusation. Just 4 words. Daniel was not alone. The investigators reconstructed the final evening again. Daniel left work. He entered the cafe. He walked toward the building. Someone else may have been following him. Daniel entered through the rear service entrance. Another person entered after him. At some point, someone photographed the scene from inside. Then police arrived. The mysterious figure appeared in the exterior photograph. The box was found. And later, the box disappeared from police custody. This sequence explained many of the contradictions. But it created one final problem. If Daniel was inside the building with another person, why was there no evidence of a struggle? Why had nobody heard anything? Why had Daniel's belongings remained at home? The answer might be that Daniel had entered the building voluntarily. He may have known the person. He may even have expected to meet them. That possibility changed the case completely. Daniel may not have been abducted from the street. He may have walked into the building willingly, but then something happened, something the investigators never documented. The envelope contained one more item. A small piece of paper. It appeared to be a copy of a telephone number. No name, no address, just the number. Investigators checked historical telephone records. The number belonged to a private office. The office had been used by the company that once rented the upper floor of the building. That company had closed years earlier, but one former employee was still alive. Investigators contacted him. He remembered the building, he remembered the company, and he remembered Henrik Vale. But when asked about Daniel Voss, he became uncomfortable. He said Daniel had visited the building before. Not once, several times. That was new. Daniel had apparently known about the building long before his disappearance. He may have been investigating something himself. The former employee refused to explain what. He only said one thing. Daniel was looking for a name. What name? He would not say. The investigators asked about Elise Marin. The employee went silent. Then he ended the interview. That reaction was perhaps the strongest clue they had found. The two disappearances might not have been connected by the building. They might have been connected by what both people had discovered. And now the mystery had become much larger than one photograph. Someone had been hiding information. Someone had removed evidence. Someone had kept photographs. And someone had apparently known that Daniel was investigating the same secret as Elise. But there was still no proof of who that person was. No confession, no body, no definitive suspect. Only a trail of evidence that seemed to point toward a hidden investigation inside an old building. And then came the most unsettling discovery of all. The envelope containing Vale's photograph had been sealed after his death. But the paper inside was not decades old. The ink was recent, much newer than the photograph. Someone had added the final sentence years after Daniel disappeared. Someone had written, "Daniel was not alone." And if that sentence was written recently, then somebody knew the truth long after the original investigation ended. The final discovery changed the meaning of everything. Investigators had spent years trying to identify the figure in the photograph. But perhaps they had been asking the wrong question. The figure might not have been the mystery. The photograph itself was. The original negative was examined one final time. There were no signs of obvious manipulation, no missing frames, no cuts, no evidence that the image had been digitally altered. The photograph was genuine, but genuine did not mean the first interpretation was correct. The figure in the window was almost certainly created by a combination of reflection, darkness, and a person standing inside the building. That explained the strange shape. It explained why the figure appeared to vanish. It explained why different photographs showed different outlines. The supernatural explanation collapsed, but something much more human remained. Someone had been inside the building. Daniel had probably been there too, and someone connected to the investigation had removed the metal container. Those facts could not be erased simply by explaining the photograph. Then investigators solved the final mystery. The small object on the windowsill was not a mysterious device. It was a document box, and the box had belonged to the police department. Inside it had apparently been several documents related to the old company that once occupied the building. Most of those documents were never recovered, but one copy survived. It contained names, dates, payments, and references to Elise Marin. Then another name appeared. Daniel Voss. The connection was real. Daniel had been investigating the same company that Elise had encountered years earlier. The two disappearances were not necessarily identical, but they were connected by information. Daniel had discovered something. Elise had apparently discovered something similar, and Henrik Vale had discovered that someone inside the investigation knew more than they were admitting. That explained why Vale kept private notes. It explained why he questioned the official timeline. It explained why he removed the box. He may have believed the evidence was unsafe inside the police archive. But there was still one unanswered question. Why did he never reveal the documents? Perhaps he was afraid. Perhaps he believed nobody would believe him. Or perhaps he was protecting someone. We cannot know. Vale never explained himself. The company records eventually disappeared. The building was renovated. The old room was destroyed. The rear entrance was sealed permanently, and Daniel Voss was never found. The official case remains unresolved, but the photograph survived. That single image still exists as the most unsettling piece of evidence from the investigation. Not because it proves a ghost stood behind the window. It does not. Not because it proves a secret organization was operating inside the building. It does not. Its importance comes from something much simpler. The photograph captured something the official record failed to explain. A person, a box, a missing timeline, and evidence that someone had tried to remove from the case. There is still one detail investigators cannot explain. The final photograph found in Henrik Vale's locker was supposed to have been taken on the night Daniel disappeared, but the camera that took it was not registered to Vale. It belonged to Daniel, and Daniel's camera was never recovered. That means someone had his camera after he disappeared. Someone used it. Someone took a photograph from inside the building, and someone kept that photograph for decades. Then, long after Daniel disappeared, somebody wrote 4 words on the back of it. Daniel was not alone. We still do not know who wrote them. We still do not know who stood inside that room. We still do not know what happened to Daniel, and we still do not know why Henrik Vale removed the evidence. The photograph has an explanation. The reflection has an explanation. The missing box has a possible explanation. But the final question remains. If the evidence was innocent, why did someone spend so much effort hiding it? That is the part of the story that remains unresolved. Because sometimes, the most frightening evidence is not the evidence that proves something impossible. It is the evidence that proves something happened and then disappears before anyone can discover why.